Communism is always presented as bad. What would you say to them? What is communism?
Number one, of course we understand that historically the American society, starting with the days of McCartney, the anti-communist ideology was hammered in and communists were prosecuted because the Soviet Union was the only country in the world that proposed an alternative to the global capitalism, the system that was being built by the US and its Western allies and elsewhere in the world. The current model, the capitalist model, is at a deadlock. And at the Valdai Forum, the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, said that the existing capitalist model is at a deadlock. You've made the right point. Almost 800 million people on this planet are suffering from famine and are living from hand to mouth, whereas there is a colossal division between the super rich and the poor, and the Forbes list is being expanded. And if we look at the US, there is a problem with access to good quality medical care for poor people, and actually social justice is what all people have to aim at, given that currently the wealth is concentrated in very few hands to the detriment of millions of billions of people on this planet. And the representative of communist and left-wing parties are declaring that we need to aim at social justice. And the Communist Party of the Russian Federation follows suit. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the Russian communists united the ideas of justice and socialism with the fight for national interests of our country. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the West tried to transform Russia into its own colony, a raw materials colony. Quite often they appointed their representatives to government authorities in Russia. I often speak and I'm often interviewed by TV channels and in Russia, and I often address the problem of the disintegration of society and a strong division between the rich and the poor. And there is a radicalization. The pendulum swings too far right, radically right, as represented by Trump and his administration, or radically left. I was happy to learn that 62% of young Americans under 30 years of age have a positive view of socialism. I remember the days when the United States tried to fight socialist ideas at universities, and they declared the communist threat. But on the other hand, you often label politicians in the US. For the incumbent administration, communists are enemies, or everyone who is in the left wing. Well, actually, this is an attempt to find a new threat, and this brings us back to the Cold War times, whereas, in fact, we need to unite our efforts in order to achieve one single goal, basically conquer poverty like China has done when there is no poverty in this country. Unfortunately, the global capital, having the military machine, is trying to nip such attempts in the bud. And we as communists are fighting for justice along with other people on this planet.
It would seem to me that Russia is not a ripe area for a communist ideology in comparison to, say, the United States. And let me explain what I mean by that. In Russia, the universal education is widely available. There has been a decrease and the level of the extremes in income, a concentration of wealth that occurred during the 1990s with a small number of the oligarchs, with the vast majority of the Russian people in the 1990s suffering extreme poverty. And they've been elevated now to a higher middle class. Healthcare, my understanding, is widely available. You don't have to be rich to get good health care. You have to be Russian to get good health, or if you're in Russia, you get good health care. Whereas in my own country, the gap between the very wealthy and the very poor is growing. It's not diminishing. Right now, in the high schools, the grade 12, there are, particularly in the inner cities, the major cities like New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, as many as 80% of the students do not read at grade level, do not do math at grade level. So it's almost like a deliberate de-education where the people aren't being educated. That's why I say I think that kind of environment is more ripe for the type of social justice you're talking about. And it may explain in part why there is, I'm not sure about these labels anymore, socialism, capitalism, because what I've seen in the United States, Social Security, that's a form of socialism. And a lot of Americans like to get their Social Security check. So I think maybe there's a need to try to come up with new terms to say, can we create a society where there are not where people are not impoverished or just because of where they're born or who they're born to? You think that's a fair point?
I fully agree with you. And to close off your first question, I've said that the task of the whole world is to unite our forces to fight poverty. And we, as Russian communists, have this task of eradicating the strong division between the rich and the poor. But you are right, we have a strong education system and a strong healthcare system. Let's be honest, after the great socialist revolution, October Revolution, there was a civil war, but there was a labor code adopted that dictated an 8-hour working day. There were also other laws adopted to grant women maternity leaves, etc. And many people in the West, having seen what Russia was proposing to its population, they began copying such social projects in the US and Europe to make sure that the working class did not embark on a revolution process. When the West saw that the alternative was destroyed, the Soviet Union was destroyed, there was a question raised: why should we raise salaries? Why should we provide benefits and high security checks to our working class? They do not have an alternative. We can maximize our profits in the interests of transnational oligarchy. Therefore, the disintegration of the Soviet Union had a major impact on our country, but it hit the Western world as well, the capitalist world, because there was no alternative, there was no example to emulate for the West. In our country, despite all the attempts during Yeltsin times and attempts to copycat the Western countries, thanks to Gennady Zyuganov's efforts, thanks to our our party, we managed to preserve our social achievements. And you see, it was quite unexpected for the West. They thought, look at that, the Soviet Union has collapsed. The communists communism has been destroyed, but China made its breakthrough. I visit China very often, and they are copying a lot of experience gained by the Soviet Union. Therefore, we promote peace to the world, but our purpose is to build a multipolar world and make sure that our citizens have the right social environment, all infrastructure needed, etc. We are not competing against anyone. We clearly say that we can draw a line of distinction between bourgeois governments who are aggressive and the population in various countries. And people from various countries are suffering because of wars and arms race. And the Western, and if we look at the West, Western Europe is an eloquent example of requirements imposed by the United States on its junior allies in Europe. And we can see that European benefits are going down. And we have lots of acquaintances in Western Europe, and they are complaining that the life standards are being deteriorated. In our country, we promote all types of ownership. We believe that there must be a government sector and a private sector, but the workforce, workers have to get fair and reasonable salaries and wages. And you know, if we look at salaries and wages, then we can see government-owned companies which generate profit, but the profit does not end up in the pockets of company owners, but is used by the company, by the government to build schools, hospitals, and etc. Look at Western Europe, at Rheinmetall in Germany. When the special military operation was launched, its share price was increased 20 times. But in Russia, the military and industrial complex is owned by the government, the majority of such companies, and no one is lining its pockets, whereas the United States have earned a lot of money. And the lobbyism of major companies leads to negative consequences because the profit is not used for the benefit of the underprivileged. We need to reach an agreement. We need to put an end to confrontation, put an end to wars, and work for the benefit of the entire world.
Yeah, this, particularly the events, I'd say, of the last 30 years, and since the collapse of the Soviet Union, have sort of destroyed a lot of the mythology, what I'll call the traditional mythology pitting communism against capitalism. And so the way when I was growing up, I was born in 1955, so I grew up in the middle of the Cold War. And so we're always taught, oh, those communists, they hate private property, no private property allowed. They hate religion. They're going to eradicate all the churches. And we've got to have economic competition. And yet what we've seen, what has transpired in the West, and you make the precise point with respect to the defense industry, is right now in the United States, it's almost the if you will, the capitalists in the defense industry are setting the strategic picture, which actually has nothing to do with real strategy. Whereas in Russia, because the government owns the defense industry, you're not getting the kind of political, money's not buying weapon systems. In other words, the key issue is not how much profit is this going to return to, say, Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or General Dynamics, but rather what we've seen during the special military operation is as needs have arisen, like we need to have a fiber optic drone, boom, the government is producing fiber optic drones fairly quickly, much quicker than could be done in the West. So is that communism? Is that, or is that just sensible policy?
This is a completely sensible policy. You have used the word collapse of the Soviet Union. For us it was a targeted destruction of the great Soviet Union, and the West played its role, and Western special forces did that. Unfortunately, Gorbachev and Yeltsin betrayed the interests of our country. I was born and raised in the hero city of Tula. This city was not occupied by German Nazi forces. Historically, it was a major defense center. The first factory to manufacture weapons was built by Peter the Great, and it was producing weapons during the Soviet times. And I remember that in 1990s there were lots of attempts to destroy defense industry plants and close them down. It was a tooth and nail fight, and Gennady Zyuganov and Vasily Starodubtsev, the governor of the Tula region, a member of the Communist Party, managed to save the defense industry companies in Tula. And these plants are used to protect our country and defend it against the hybrid war that is led against our country. We are not threatening anyone. We are defending our sovereignty. And the president of the Russian Federation said it on the eve of the special military operation. He spoke about security guarantees and creating a safe and just world. And Russian military and defense complex is government-owned. And my compatriots work in 3 shifts to ensure security of our country. It is not a random story that drones are targeting these plants, but in order to preserve and protect our defense industry and social infrastructure, we managed to create the right foundation. And the West should not cherish illusions. It is quite obvious that no one will be able to conquer Russia in the military sphere. And we know what was done by the Brits as thought up by Churchill when, after the Great Patriotic War, they wanted to send 50 divisions against the Soviet Union, including 12 German divisions. We are the country that ensures parity. Therefore, no one can win a victory over us. Therefore, it is in the interest of the entire world to get together and reach an agreement. And Russia has proposed a strategic weapons treaty that will be treaty number 3 and arms race leads to more poverty. And if countries pursue this ideology, this would support the we would like to say that the West wanted to destroy a lot of things that we inherited from the Soviet Union, but they failed to do so. And we're ramping up, and our capacity is growing, and we'll continue working.
If somebody from the planet Mars would land in the world today, and they had to do a side-by-side comparison of the United States and Russia, well, they'd go to the United States, and as I mentioned earlier, they'd look at the kids, the children coming out of high school, and notice, boy, in the United States, there's a large number that don't know how to read and don't know how to do math. They'd come to Russia and they say, if you come out of a Russian high school, you're educated. You know how to read and you know how to do math. They'd look at the space program. They'd notice, since at least 2004, the United States needed to rely on Russia to get to the space station. We couldn't do it on our own. With respect to air defense systems, Russia's created effective air defense systems that can defeat ballistic missiles. The United States has not. Russia has developed hypersonic missiles. The United States has not. Just in the war production, Russia with half the population of the United States. I think Russia is about 160 million people. The United States is 330 million. Yet Russia outproduces the United States. Tanks, artillery shells, artillery barrels. And then in terms of a productive economy, you actually make things in Russia. In the United States, it's losing its ability to make things, to manufacture. So what is the difference between those two societies? Is it because out of this formerly communist society, a new form of economy, a new form of government has emerged out of I'll call it the tragedy of the 90s because of what Russia suffered. And yet, is that, do you think, did the communist heritage play any role in that?